Welcome to today's gripping story. Imagine a world where a seemingly perfect life unravels with a single decision. Meet Frank and Janice, one man caught between a manipulative mother and his ailing wife. What begins as a seemingly practical solution to an impossible situation quickly spirals into a heart-wrenching ordeal. As Frank decides to leave Janice in a remote village, a shocking twist reveals the true depth of betrayal and love. Follow their journey from hope to heartbreak, as one man faces the devastating consequences of his actions. Stay tuned to witness an emotional roller coaster that will keep you on the edge of your seat. If you are not subscribed, I recommend you subscribe and activate the bell to avoid missing any videos. In a cramped room suffused with the faded scent of yellow floral wallpaper, two figures stood locked in a tense confrontation. Mrs. Pickles, a diminutive woman whose graying hair and sharp, unforgiving features mirrored the coldness in her heart, dominated the space. Her face, hardened by years of bitterness, bore an aquiline nose and lips so thin they seemed etched onto her face. Around her neck hung a rough, weighty necklace that jangled with each biting, incisive word she flung into the air. "Frank, don't you see? We can't keep living this way," she declared, her voice slicing through the room as she lifted her chin defiantly. "She's become an obstacle." The man, her son, stood across from her, his body tense with an internal struggle. Frank's gentle features, so different from his mother's, now appeared worn and sorrowful, as if the weight of the world had settled on his shoulders. His hands, trembling slightly, moved in helpless gestures, and his eyes, filled with a mix of defiance and guilt, refused to meet hers. "But Mom, Janice is my wife," he responded, his voice tinged with desperation, as if clinging to a fleeting sense of duty. Mrs. Pickles spread her arms wide, a mocking sneer curling her lips. "Oh, if you truly cared for her, you wouldn't have let things get to this point. And I certainly won't play nursemaid to a woman who's more like a wilted flower than a wife. You heard the doctor, she has less than a year left. Why waste our lives waiting around? She'd be better off at her grandmother's, where the memories of her past might offer her some comfort. Besides, once she's gone, there's an inheritance coming your way. That could pull us out of this wretched existence." Frank's gaze lingered on his mother's face, a storm of emotions brewing within him. Finally, he sighed, a heavy, resigned sound that echoed the turmoil in his heart. The following day, the hallway was cluttered with bags and suitcases, each one stuffed with Janice's belongings, a stark testament to her impending departure. Mrs. Pickles, her face twisted into a smug grin, took a perverse pleasure in the sight of her bewildered daughter-in-law. Janice, once a vibrant and petite young woman with flowing blonde hair, now sat helplessly in her wheelchair. At only 27, a cruel stroke had stolen her vitality, leaving her not only paralyzed but also robbed of speech. Trapped in her own body, she spent her days in silence, confined to that wheelchair like a prisoner in her own home. While Frank was away at work, it was Mrs. Pickles who assumed the role of caretaker, though her care was far from compassionate. Janice couldn't shake the gnawing suspicion that her husband stayed late at the office on purpose, avoiding the heartbreaking reality of his once lively wife reduced to this fragile state. Deep down, Janice knew that her mother-in-law had never truly accepted her. Mrs. Pickles had always been irritated by Janice's drive and ambition, believing that a wife should be devoted to supporting her husband rather than chasing career dreams. Janice had been an assistant to the director of a large company, with aspirations of starting her own business one day. But the dream had been just that, a dream cruelly snatched away before she could even gather the funds to make it a reality. The stroke had erased whatever sliver of sympathy Mrs. Pickles might have had for Janice. Before, she had merely been a constant source of irritation, nagging and undermining her daughter-in-law at every turn. But after the stroke, her disdain transformed into outright cruelty. She yelled at Janice with unbridled frustration. dismissing her silent pleas for help, and frequently forgot to give her medicine or prepare meals. The only solace Mrs. Pickles found in this new arrangement was the fact that Janice, now mute, couldn't interrupt her as she indulged in rereading the old plays she had once performed during her theater days. As Frank strained under the weight of the suitcases, loading them into the car with a heavy heart, Janice remained inside, her wheelchair pressed against the door. She watched the scene unfold before her, her eyes wide with silent terror. Her red-rimmed eyes filled with unshed tears, reflecting the sheer helplessness and despair she felt as her world was packed away piece by piece, her life reduced to nothing more than a burden to those around her. "Don't worry, dear Mrs." Pickles grinned, her voice dripping with false sweetness. "The doctor mentioned your heart's not as strong as it once was, and the fresh air in the village will do you good. Who knows? You might even outlive the year. Didn't you always long to return to your granny's house in the countryside?" Janice's mind was a storm of unspoken thoughts, emotions swirling within her, desperate to escape. If only she could speak, she would have unleashed her fury on her mother-in-law, spilling out every ounce of bitterness she harbored toward the woman whose gray hair and sharp tongue had become her torment. "Frank, dear, what took you so long, Mrs.?" Pickles turned to her son, her expression one of feigned concern, though her eyes sparkled with impatience. Frank stood before them, breathless and weary, his chest heaving from the exertion. "The elevator broke down," Frank explained, his voice strained as he tried to catch his breath. "I had to carry everything down from the 20th floor." Mrs. Pickles shook her head, a look of reproach directed at Janice. "And I told you we should hire movers," she scolded, her tone thick with judgment. "Mom, you know we can't afford that," Frank replied, a hint of frustration creeping into his voice. Mrs. Pickles sighed dramatically, her mind drifting to a time long past. "Oh, Sonny, there was a time when I performed in theaters every day, filling entire halls with my talent. Your father would rush over after his lectures just to watch me shine on stage." She reminisced, her voice tinged with a nostalgia that seemed almost out of place. Could I have ever imagined that my life would come to this, changing diapers? She cast a disdainful glance at Janice, her contempt barely masked by her brief lapse into memory. The silence that followed was heavy, filled with the unspoken tension that had plagued their relationship for years. Just then, the neighbor emerged from the building, breaking the awkward stillness. "Mrs. Pickles, good afternoon," the neighbor greeted with a nod. "Are you headed somewhere?" Mrs. Pickles' demeanor shifted instantly, a broad smile plastered across her face. "Hello there. We're just taking Janice to a boarding house for some much-needed rehabilitation. The doctor said it should help her recovery." The neighbor's brow furrowed with concern. "That must be quite expensive, isn't it?" "Oh yes, very costly, Mrs." Pickles sighed, playing the part of the caring mother-in-law to perfection. "But what can we do? I can't leave my poor daughter-in-law without the treatment she needs. She's done so much for us." The neighbor nodded sympathetically, exchanged a few more words, and then went on her way. As soon as she was out of earshot, the smile vanished from Mrs. Pickles' face, replaced by a sharp frown. She turned to Frank, her voice dripping with irritation. "Let's get a move on before the entire neighborhood knows our business. We should have done this first thing in the morning." Frank hefted the suitcase into his hands, his patience wearing thin. "It's freezing in the morning, Mom. It's 4 in the afternoon now, and you want me to risk frostbite," he retorted, not bothering to wait for a response as he marched toward the car, leaving his mother to fume in his wake. The tension between them hung in the air, heavy and palpable, as they prepared to carry out a plan that none of them could truly justify, yet felt powerless to stop. Frank had always been the apple of his parents' eye, their only child and the light of their lives. Mrs. Pickles and her husband Michael had welcomed him into the world late in life. after careers that had seen them both reach great heights, Michael as a respected professor of law at the university, and Mrs. Pickles as a celebrated star of the local drama theater. They had both set aside their ambitions to pour all their energy and attention into raising Frank, but their intense devotion had produced a man who, now nearing 40, was still frail, dependent, and deeply entangled in the cocoon of his mother's influence. He lived under her roof, toiling away at a low-paying job where his boss belittled him, and his colleagues barely tolerated his presence. 20 minutes later, the last of Janice's belongings were crammed into the car, and Frank carefully positioned his wife and her folded wheelchair in the back seat. The entire process felt like a slow march toward an inevitable conclusion, one that neither Frank nor Janice could escape. Tears streamed down Janice's face, each drop a silent protest against the cruel fate that had been thrust upon her. "Janice, calm down, please," Frank murmured as he adjusted his seatbelt, his voice barely more than a whisper, as if he feared that speaking too loudly would break the fragile remnants of their bond. Mrs. Pickles, never one to miss an opportunity to assert her authority, cut in with her usual sharpness. "A neighbor will keep an eye on you while you're there. We'll pay her out of your money, of course." Frank, accustomed to his mother's ways, simply shrugged and nodded in agreement. "We're not exactly flush with cash right now, as you know, so yes, it'll have to come from your funds, but you'll be better off there." Janice stared at her husband, her tear-filled eyes searching his face for any sign of compassion, any hint of reluctance. She desperately hoped to find some trace of the man she had married, the man who had once promised to stand by her through thick and thin. But all she saw was a pale, emotionless mask, devoid of the pity she so desperately craved. At precisely noon, the car pulled away from the home that had once been filled with their shared hopes and dreams. Mrs. Pickles stood at the doorstep, waving a brisk farewell before retreating inside to lose herself in the pages of her old playbooks. She could already picture herself back on the stage, the applause of the audience ringing in her ears, as if she could rewrite her past through the faded scripts in her hands. Meanwhile, Frank, his heart heavy with conflicting emotions, pressed his foot harder on the gas pedal, eager to put distance between himself and the painful reality that lingered in the back seat. "Janice, you have to understand," Frank began, his voice faltering as he avoided glancing in the rearview mirror, where he knew he'd see his wife's swollen, tear-streaked eyes. "I have no other choice." For a fleeting moment, he thought he saw Janice raise an eyebrow in silent mockery, a flash of the old fire that used to spark between them. But when he wiped his glasses and looked again, all he saw was her grieving, resigned expression, a face etched with sorrow and disbelief. "My mom is trying to make things better for us," Frank continued, though even he could hear the hollowness in his words. "She's right. I can't look after you all the time. I have to work, and she's not getting any younger. You'll be better off there. You'll have your nurse, someone who can take care of you properly. You'll be back at your grandmother's house, the place you always talked about so fondly." But deep down, Frank knew that these justifications were as thin as the air he breathed. He was abandoning the woman he had vowed to cherish and protect, leaving her to face a bleak future alone, all because he couldn't bear the weight of her needs or the pressure from his domineering mother. And as the miles stretched out before them, the distance between what was and what could have been grew wider, until all that was left was the painful reality that they had both been cast adrift, victims of a life that had taken a tragic, irreversible turn. Frank fell silent once more, unable to bear the intensity of Janice's gaze. Though he kept his eyes fixed on the road ahead, he could feel her silent plea pressing against his back, a weight that seemed to tighten around his chest and quicken his breath. Her unspoken words burned through the fabric of his jacket, searing into his lungs as he tried to push the guilt aside. But it clung to him, relentless and suffocating. The drive to the remote village where Janice would be left behind was agonizingly long. Each passing mile seemed to stretch out endlessly, amplifying the sense of dread that hung in the air. The village itself was little more than a forgotten relic, almost completely abandoned, with only a few dilapidated houses lining its two main streets. A lone store stood at the heart of the village, its once bright sign faded and peeling, and an old medical office sat in disrepair, its doors closed for years due to a chronic lack of staff. As the dark blue car rumbled past, they approached a small house that had seen better days. The garden, once meticulously cared for, was now a wild tangle of century-old trees and overgrown grass that reached above the dilapidated fence in some places. The house itself, though worn, still retained a certain charm, at least from the outside. In front of a weather-beaten window, an old bench sat crookedly, and on it, a figure lay sprawled, barely moving. While Frank busied himself with the task of unloading Janice from the car and sorting out her wheelchair and belongings, she remained fixated on the figure on the bench. Her eyes, unblinking and sharp, tried to pierce the hazy distance, straining to identify the silhouette that seemed so out of place next to her late grandmother's home. The sun's glare made it difficult to see, and the figure remained a mystery. Then, as if roused by the disturbance, the figure on the bench stirred, muttering incoherently. A woman slowly rose and began to stagger toward the gate, her steps unsteady. As she drew closer, Janice could make out the details of her face deeply lined and sagging, her skin marred by age and hardship. Her hair was a tangled mess, and an old bruise, faded but unmistakable, darkened the skin beneath one of her eyes. Her clothes were a mismatched assortment: a yellow t-shirt too bright for the season, green shorts that left her legs exposed to the chill, and pink, rhinestone-studded shoes that were frayed at the edges. You're so early," the woman stammered, her voice shaky and uncertain. Frank frowned, glancing from the woman to Janice. "This is your nurse, Janice. Let's get acquainted. Her name is P. She'll be taking care of you from now on." His words were met with a vague nod from P, who wobbled slightly on her feet. With a heavy sigh, Frank set about unloading the rest of the suitcases from the car, each one thudding to the ground with a finality that echoed in the stillness. He carried them into the house, one by one, each step feeling like another nail in the coffin of his guilt. When he was done, he approached P, slipping her a thin envelope. The gesture was quick, almost furtive, as if he were ashamed of the meager contents. Yet, judging by the way P's eyes lit up, it was enough to keep her here, enough to ensure that Janice would be someone else's responsibility. Finally, Frank stood before his wife, his heart heavy with the knowledge of what he was about to do. He sighed deeply, the sound filled with all the words he couldn't bring himself to say, all the apologies that would never be spoken. His eyes met Janice's, but only for a fleeting moment before he looked away, unable to face the depth of her despair. "Janice," he began, his voice breaking, "this is for the best. You'll be well taken care of here." But even as he said the words, he knew they were a lie he told himself to make the unbearable slightly more bearable. And as he turned to leave, the sound of the car door closing behind him felt like the final severing of the life they once shared. Janice remained in her wheelchair, her eyes locked on the house she would now call home, the tears long since dried on her cheeks. All that remained was a hollow ache, a grief too deep for words, and a future that had never felt more uncertain. "Janice, why are you so disgruntled?" Frank forced a smile, though it faltered as he spoke. "I'm sure deep down you're smiling. This is your childhood home." After all, his eyes swept over the overgrown garden and the broken gate, trying to find some comfort in the scene, but failing. "Fresh air, constant care, what else do you need to be happy?" The words hung in the air, empty and hollow. Frank knew it, and so did Janice. Without waiting for a response, Frank turned on his heel and hurried away, his feet moving faster, as if he could outrun the crushing weight of guilt bearing down on him. His mother's voice echoed in his mind, telling him that this was the only choice, the right choice. But each step felt like a betrayal, each breath heavier than the last. He couldn't bring himself to turn back. Janice remained in her wheelchair, her eyes fixed on the figure of her husband disappearing down the driveway. Her thoughts were a chaotic whirl, a mix of despair, anger, and a deep, gnawing sadness. She couldn't even voice her feelings, her body a prison that kept her silent. Beside her, P stumbled slightly as she set down the suitcase, her eyes bleary and unfocused, giving Janice a look of drunken indifference. Meanwhile, Frank's hands shook as he fumbled to start the car. He needed to leave, to escape the sight of Janice's silent, sorrowful face. The engine roared to life, and he sped away, his heart pounding in his chest. The world outside blurred as his tears fogged up his glasses, but he didn't care. He just wanted to be as far away as possible, to drown out the voice in his head that screamed at him for what he had done. When he reached the highway, he pulled into a gas station, turning off the engine with a shaky hand. The silence was deafening as he sat there, alone with his thoughts. Frank buried his face in his hands, but the memories flooded back with relentless clarity. He could see Janice, her light hair fluttering in the wind, standing tall and confident as she discussed work in front of a courtroom. She had been so full of life, so vibrant before the stroke. A wave of grief crashed over him as he realized how much he still loved her, how much he had lost by letting his mother dictate their lives. A burning sense of guilt flared up within him, searing through his chest. He couldn't leave her there, not with that nurse, not in that state. Without another thought, Frank turned the car around, his foot heavy on the gas, as he raced back toward the village. Speed limits be damned, he needed to get back to Janice, to undo the terrible mistake he had made. She had been left alone with an inadequate nurse, and the thought filled him with panic. He had to save her. Janice, Frank called out as he skidded to a stop in front of the house. He leaped out of the car, his heart pounding with fear, and dashed inside, taking the steps 3 at a time. The front door was wide open, creaking eerily in the breeze. Frank froze in the middle of the hallway, his breath catching in his throat. "Janice, where are you?" His voice echoed through the empty house, but there was no answer. He frantically searched the living room, then the bedroom, each empty room increasing his dread. His heart nearly stopped when he heard a muffled noise from outside. Without thinking, he bolted out the door and around the side of the house. There, in the distance, he saw P, her unsteady gait making her wobble as she pushed Janice's wheelchair down the road. A twisted smile played on P's lips as if she were in some sick, drunken fantasy. Frank's blood ran cold at the sight. "Janice," he shouted, his voice breaking as he ran toward them. The desperation in his voice seemed to carry across the distance, reaching Janice in a way that words never could. P turned slightly, her movements sluggish, but she continued pushing the wheelchair, oblivious to Frank's approach. The sight of Janice slumped and powerless in that chair fueled Frank's determination. He had to get to her before it was too late. With a burst of energy, Frank sprinted the final stretch, his heart thundering in his chest. He finally reached the wheelchair, grabbing the handles from P with a force that made the drunken woman stumble backward. Frank pulled Janice close, his arms wrapping around her protectively as he gasped for breath. "Janice, I'm so sorry," he whispered, his voice choked with emotion. "I should never have left you here." Janice's eyes, still full of sadness, looked up at him, and though she couldn't speak, Frank could see the pain and betrayal in her gaze. But beneath it, there was a flicker of something else, relief, perhaps that he had come back for her. Frank glared at P, who had fallen to the ground, her vacant eyes staring up at the sky. "Get away from us," he growled, his voice low and dangerous. Without another word, Frank turned the wheelchair around and started back toward the house. He knew this was just the beginning of making things right. But as he pushed Janice up the path, he vowed that he would never let anyone, not even his mother, come between them again. He would find a way to care for her, to make up for the pain he had caused. And as they moved away from the road, away from the shadow of what had nearly happened, Frank felt a small, fragile hope begin to stir within him. "Who are you?" P snarled, her eyes flashing with fury as she tightened her grip on the wheelchair. She jerked it forward, hastily maneuvering Janice down the overgrown path toward the road. "You better get out of my way, or you're gonna have a real problem." Frank didn't hesitate. He lunged toward P, grabbing her arm with a force fueled by desperation and guilt. "Janice, I'm so sorry," he pleaded, his voice breaking as he looked into his wife's tear-streaked face. "I should never have left you here," he turned to the drunk nurse, his expression darkening with a mix of disdain and regret. "How dare you treat her like this?" P yanked her arm free with a violent motion, her face twisting in anger. Without missing a beat, she spat in his face, her voice dripping with contempt. "What do you care? You left her here with me. You're just as bad." The words cut through Frank like a knife. He felt the weight of his betrayal crashing down on him, the reality of what he had done sinking in deeper than ever. He looked at Janice, her face pale and drawn, her eyes brimming with tears, her lips trembling with the weight of her unspoken anguish. The realization hit him like a wave, overwhelming him with guilt and sorrow. Without another word, Frank turned Janice's wheelchair around, moving with frantic urgency. He loaded her back into the car as quickly as he could, his hands trembling with the fear of what could have happened. Before climbing into the driver's seat, he cast one final look at P, shaking his head in disbelief at the situation he had allowed to unfold. Then, without a backward glance, he sped away from the house, his mind racing as fast as the car. As they drove, Frank couldn't stop apologizing. His voice was thick with emotion, each word a desperate plea for forgiveness. "Janice, I'm so sorry. I was weak. I was wrong. I'll never leave you again. Please forgive me." The journey home was a blur, the scenery outside the car window slipping past unnoticed as Frank focused solely on Janice. He hoped, with every fiber of his being, that she could find it in her heart to forgive him, that they could somehow move past this terrible chapter. That evening, when they finally arrived home, the atmosphere was tense. Frank knew they had a long road ahead of them to rebuild what had been broken. But as they entered the house, the news of an unexpected inheritance lifted the mood. The family gathered, and even Mrs. Pickles, who had always been so critical, seemed to soften. She opened a bottle of expensive wine in celebration, her usual stern demeanor giving way to rare warmth. The inheritance brought a sense of relief, a feeling that things might finally start looking up. Janice, for a brief moment, felt like life was on the mend. She thought back to Christina, the friend who had warned her about trusting too easily, and she wondered if she had been wrong after all. Over the next few weeks, the tension in the house eased. Mrs. Pickles stopped her nagging, and Frank began spending more time with Janice, trying to make up for his previous neglect. Life seemed to be taking a turn for the better. One day, while walking down the street, Janice felt a rare sense of contentment. She smiled at the world around her, her spirits lifted by the recent changes. On a whim, she decided to stop by a men's clothing store to buy a new tie as a gift for Frank, a small token of her appreciation for the man she still loved, despite everything. As she glanced at the shop window, her thoughts full of anticipation, she didn't notice at first who was nearby. But then, out of the corner of her eye, she saw him, Frank. Her heart leaped, and she was about to call out to him, a smile forming on her lips. But the smile froze as she saw a young woman approaching him. Janice watched, her heart pounding in her chest, as Frank embraced the woman and kissed her. The world seemed to spin around her. Janice stumbled backward, her legs threatening to give out beneath her. She reached out, grasping the edge of the shop window to steady herself. her breath caught in her throat, disbelief and shock coursing through her veins. She couldn't tear her eyes away from the scene before her, the image of Frank with another woman searing itself into her mind. Janice's world crumbled in an instant. The happiness she had felt only moments before was shattered, replaced by a cold, piercing pain that cut deeper than anything she had ever felt. The realization that the man she had fought to forgive, the man she had tried to rebuild her life with, was betraying her again left her reeling, her heart breaking all over again. Without making a scene, Janice returned home, her mind reeling from what she had witnessed. She moved through the evening in a daze, barely registering her surroundings. That night she went to bed early, but sleep eluded her as she lay there, contemplating the painful reality that had just unraveled before her eyes. The betrayal cut deep, and her thoughts swirled with anger, sadness, and confusion. As dawn broke, she made a decision. She took the day off from work, unable to face the world, and headed to a local detective agency. The office was small and nondescript, the kind of place that one could easily overlook. Inside, a short, thin man with glasses sat at a modest desk, absorbed in a newspaper and sipping coffee. The room smelled faintly of stale cigarettes and old paper. Janice sat down across from him, her voice steady despite the storm brewing inside her, and laid out the situation. "I want to know everything," she said, her voice firm and resolute. "How they met, where they go, what they do together, their actions, the places they date. I want to know everything." The detective listened carefully, nodding occasionally, his eyes sharp behind the lenses of his glasses. He didn't ask unnecessary questions, just jotted down notes, his expression serious. For the next week, Janice found herself in a state of agonizing uncertainty. The days dragged on, each one filled with a mix of dread and anticipation. She didn't dare tell Christina the truth, not wanting to hear the inevitable, "I told you so." But she couldn't shake the feeling that Christina had always seen through Frank. Her friend had never warmed to him and had even refused to be the maid of honor at their wedding, a slight that had hurt Janice deeply at the time. Though they had eventually reconciled, the wound had never fully healed. Now, as Janice replayed the past in her mind, she began to understand Christina's reluctance. Christina had only wanted to protect her, to shield her from the pain that was now her reality. A week later, the call from the detective came. Janice's heart pounded as she made her way back to the small office, a mix of dread and determination in her chest. When she sat down across from the detective again, his expression was one of triumph, as though he had uncovered a particularly juicy secret. "You know, you're lucky," he began, a grin spreading across his face. "Your husband's mistress is quite the talker. I had to follow her around for nearly a week, interview her friends, and piece together the puzzle, but I found out everything. Her name is Aisha Selick. She's 22 years old, just out of pedagogical college. They met a few months ago, probably at a coffee shop." Janice listened intently, her heart sinking with each word. The picture the detective painted was all too clear, and it stung worse than she had anticipated. "Thank you for the information," she managed to say, keeping her voice steady. "But what about any evidence, like a video?" The detective's grin widened, as if he had been waiting for her to ask that. With a showman's flourish, he reached into his desk drawer and pulled out an old, bulky tape recorder. Janice's eyes widened in surprise. The machine was an antique, something she hadn't seen since her childhood. It looked out of place in the modern world, a relic from another era. Twisting a knob, the detective turned on the recorder. The tape crackled to life, the sound distorted but clear enough to make out the voices. "Frank," a high-pitched female voice exclaimed, filled with excitement. "This is for me. Oh my goodness, it's beautiful. It must be expensive, right?" Frank's voice followed, filled with smug satisfaction. "I wouldn't spare any money for you. Once I start my own business, I'll be able to shower you with all sorts of jewelry every day." Janice felt her stomach twist as she listened, the reality of her husband's betrayal hitting her like a physical blow. The casual ease with which he spoke to Aisha and the promises he made were like daggers to her heart. But when she interrogated him, he said he didn't have money for his business, yet the detective continued, his tone almost amused as he stopped the recording. Janice sat there, the sound of the tape still ringing in her ears, feeling utterly defeated. The evidence was undeniable, and it laid bare the depth of Frank's deceit. He had not only betrayed her trust, but had also woven a web of lies around this young woman, painting himself as something he was not. For a moment, Janice felt a deep well of anger rise within her, mingling with the sorrow that had already taken root. But as she sat there, staring at the old tape recorder, something in her hardened. She knew what she had to do next. This was no longer about saving her marriage, it was about reclaiming her dignity, confronting the truth, and deciding what her future would hold without the man who had shattered her world. There were no audible sounds on the recording, but Janice could imagine Frank's broad smile as if she could see it in front of her. "My wife does," Frank's voice came through the crackling tape. "She recently inherited from her grandmother. We'll use her money to start a business and make a fortune." Aisha's voice followed, sweet and innocent, but laced with a darker curiosity. "You'll leave her, won't you?" Frank's response was clear and unhesitating, delivered with a callousness that chilled Janice to her core. "As soon as she ceases to be necessary for me, yes." The recording droned on, the voices continuing their exchange, but Janice had already stopped listening. She sat motionless, her back rigid, staring straight ahead as the detective's office faded from her awareness. Her mind drifted back through time, sifting through memories that now felt tainted and unreal. She remembered the first time she met Frank, how his charm had captivated her, how she had felt like the luckiest woman in the world when he proposed. She had been just 22, fresh out of university with a degree in economics, her life ahead of her. Frank, 11 years her senior, had seemed so mature, so kind and understanding. He had whisked her away to cozy cafes, taken her on walks under the stars, and introduced her to the world of theater and concerts. Mrs. Pickles, who had once seemed so sweet and welcoming, had embraced her like the daughter she had never had. Having recently lost her mother, Janice had been vulnerable, eager for love and acceptance, and had fallen head over heels for the intelligent, seemingly modest man who promised her the world. Christina had warned her. She had tried to steer Janice away, but Janice, blinded by the newness of love and the allure of a promising future, hadn't listened. She had been too absorbed in her feelings, too taken by the idea of building a life with Frank. The memories flooded back now, the joy of planning their wedding, choosing Frank's suit, and the overwhelming happiness she felt as they unwrapped gifts together after the celebration. Back then, she had been so sure, so certain that her happiness was eternal. But even in those early days, cracks had been there, hidden beneath the surface. Frank had never truly supported her ambitions, her dreams of a career, and starting her own business. He had been more like his mother, wanting a traditional life with a family and children, a life that Janice wasn't ready for. She had wanted more, had dreamed of more, but now those dreams lay shattered at her feet. The man who had once been so gentle, who had never raised his voice to her, had been planning to use her, to drain her of everything she had, and then discard her when she was no longer useful. It felt so unreal, so grotesque, that Janice could only sit there, staring at the wall, her mind a whirlwind of shock and disbelief. She remained silent for several minutes, lost in the enormity of her realization. The detective, used to seeing all manner of reactions from his clients, kept his distance. He'd seen rage, tears, and even violent outbursts. One woman had once smashed his office window in a fit of fury after hearing about her husband's infidelity. But Janice's silence was different. It was a cold, calculating quietness that unnerved him. He quietly got up and fetched her a glass of water, which she drank in one smooth motion, the cold liquid barely registering in her numbed senses. As she set the glass down, Christina's words echoed in her mind. Christina had always said that Frank would sell his mother for the right price. Back then, Janice had dismissed it as exaggerated cynicism, a harsh judgment from a friend who couldn't see the good in her husband. But now, those words felt disturbingly accurate. Frank's betrayal was so deep, so total, that it confirmed every warning Christina had ever given. And then, as Janice sat there, something shifted within her. The pain and shock began to morph into something else, something darker, more focused. A plan began to form in her mind, one that was sharp and clear, born out of the ashes of her shattered dreams. A vicious grin slowly spread across her face, a smile that held no warmth, only a cold, calculated resolve. The detective, who had been observing her quietly from his desk, recoiled slightly, startled by the sudden change in her demeanor. The transformation in Janice was palpable, and it unsettled him. He had never seen such an expression on her face before, a mix of determination and something else, something dangerous. Janice's mind was now working with precision. She had been a fool once, blinded by love and trust, but no more. Frank had underestimated her, had taken her for granted, and now he would pay for it. The wheels of her plan were already turning, and she knew that this time she would be the one in control. A few months later, Frank's dark blue car slowly pulled away from the gnarled fence that marked the boundary of the old, overgrown property where he had left Janice. As the car disappeared down the winding road, Janice, who had been slumped in her wheelchair, straightened up and stood, her movements steady and deliberate. P, the supposed nurse who had been left to care for her, watched in stunned silence, her eyes wide with shock. It was as if she had just witnessed a miracle. A woman she believed to be permanently disabled was now standing before her. P, let's make a deal, Janice said, her voice calm and composed. I will pay you as much as my husband does, and in return you will keep quiet about what you've seen today. P, still dazed, could only nod, too confused and overwhelmed to ask any questions. Good, Janice continued, a faint smile on her lips. We'll be great friends. Here's your first payment. She reached into her pocket and pulled out a wad of bills, handing them to P. You'll come back every month, and I'll give you more. In return, you must keep informing my husband that my condition remains unchanged and that he doesn't need to visit. Is that clear? P nodded again, quickly snatching the money from Janice's hand. Without a word, she turned and hurried away, eager to leave before more surprises unfolded. Janice watched her go, then turned and walked into the house, her expression growing more serious as she entered. Inside, the old house was just as she remembered, dusty, abandoned, and in disrepair. The furniture was covered with sheets, trash littered the floor, and one of the windows had been shattered, likely by neighborhood children looking for a place to play. Janice moved through the house with purpose, her thoughts racing. She walked over to the old red sofa in the corner of the living room, pulled off the dusty fabric, and sank onto the worn cushions. A cloud of dust rose around her, but she barely noticed. Reaching into her pocket, Janice pulled out the cell phone she had hidden from Mrs. Pickles, a lifeline that had gone undetected during her captivity. She dialed the only number she knew she could trust, her fingers steady on the buttons. Come, she said simply when the call connected. Everything happened exactly as you said it would. I'm waiting. Janice pushed the phone aside and lay back on the sofa, her mind a whirlwind of thoughts. She felt a strange mix of emotions, relief, anger, and a deep, burning resolve. How could they have been so easily deceived? How could they have left her here to die without so much as a second thought? The reality of their betrayal was still sinking in, but Janice knew she couldn't dwell on it for long. There was too much to do, too many plans to set in motion. An hour and a half later, the door creaked open, and Christina stepped inside, carrying a small grocery bag, a bottle of wine, and takeout containers. The sight of her friend brought a wave of warmth to Janice's heart. Christina had been right about everything about Frank, about Mrs. Pickles, about the need to be cautious. And now, she was here to help Janice pick up the pieces and start anew. "Good thing you brought wine," Janice said with a wry smile as Christina set the items down on the kitchen table. "I definitely wouldn't have gotten through today without it. I still can't believe they left me here for dead, and they actually believed that hastily concocted diagnosis. It's beyond my comprehension. They heard I didn't have long to live, and instead of questioning it, they started rejoicing. Where was their common sense, their concern when Dr. Grimes handed down that ridiculous verdict?" Christina nodded as she unpacked the food and poured them both a glass of wine. "People see what they want to see, Janice. They didn't care about the truth, they just wanted an easy way out, and you gave it to them." Janice raised her glass, her smile turning into a grimace. "To their gullibility then, and to us for making it through." The two women clinked their glasses together and began to eat, the silence between them filled with unspoken understanding. As they ate, they discussed their next steps, laying out the groundwork for what was to come. They talked of plans, of revenge, of reclaiming Janice's life from the ruins that Frank and Mrs. Pickles had tried to bury her in. Janice knew she had a long road ahead, but she also knew she wasn't alone. With Christina by her side, she was ready to face whatever challenges came her way. The betrayal that had once threatened to destroy her had now become the fuel for her determination. And as they sat there, sipping wine in the dusty old house, Janice began to feel a sense of peace. She had been given a second chance, and she wasn't going to waste it. "I'll stay here for a month or two until I figure out my next steps," Janice said, her voice carrying a note of resignation. "For the first time in my life, I have no plans, no clear direction. It's strange, but maybe it's what I need right now." Christina looked around the dusty old house, the overgrown garden outside, and the remote, isolated village. The contrast between her sophisticated, city-dwelling friend and this desolate place was stark. "What are you going to do here?" she asked, genuine concern in her voice. "This old, abandoned house, an overgrown garden, a remote village. You don't belong in a place like this, Janice. It's like oil and water." "If I dive headfirst into trying to fix everything right now, I'll break," Janice replied, her voice calm but firm. "I need time to breathe, to think. I haven't had a real vacation in ages. Maybe this is what I need, a forced pause to collect myself." Christina shrugged, unsure of how to respond. Frank had never sat well with her from the start. She couldn't pinpoint why, but she had always disliked him, had even refused to be Janice's maid of honor, as a way of voicing her silent protest. She had joked about Frank being willing to sell his own mother, seeing him as a spineless man, too weak to do much more than push papers at his insurance job. But seeing how he had abandoned Janice, left her to die in that lonely house, shook her to her core. The reality was much worse than she had ever imagined. Christina stayed the night with Janice, trying to offer some comfort and support, but when morning came, she had to return to her life in the city. Janice, on the other hand, had made a drastic decision. She quit her job. Unlike Christina, who needed to work, Janice had the financial cushion of her inheritance to fall back on, at least for a while. As the sun rose on a new day, Janice started it with a cold shower, hoping to clear her mind. The 3 weeks of emotional turmoil had taken a toll on her, but now that she was alone, she knew she needed to pull herself together. The test she had put Frank through had been excruciating, but the results had been clear and devastating. He hadn't shown even a shred of care or love. Instead, he had been filled with nothing but indifference and the eager anticipation of her death. That revelation had been the hardest blow of all. Her old life was over, there was no going back. But Janice was determined to find a way forward. She needed to shake off the despair that clung to her. Taking out the money Christina had brought her, Janice decided it was time to act. The first step was to clean up the house, remove the cobwebs that hung in every corner, and restore some order to her surroundings. But more than that, she needed to take control of her situation. With a sense of resolve, she took out the old phone she had hidden away and dialed a familiar number. "Mr. Pack." Janice greeted the detective when he answered. "I've thought things over, and I need you to keep working on Frank." The detective sounded puzzled. "We've already gathered the information you wanted. Why should we continue?" Janice took a deep breath, her voice steady as she spoke. "Because the story isn't over. I need to know everything he's doing, his plans, his movements, who he's talking to. I want to know what his next steps are before he even takes them. This isn't just about finding out the truth anymore. It's about making sure I'm one step ahead. I won't let him blindside me again." There was a pause on the other end of the line before the detective responded, his tone shifting to one of agreement. "All right, Mrs. Pickles. I'll continue the surveillance. But you should know, this won't be easy. Frank's a cautious man. He'll be on guard after what's happened." "I understand," Janice replied, her determination unwavering. "But I have to do this. I need to be prepared for whatever comes next. I'm not letting him get away with this." As she hung up the phone, Janice felt a renewed sense of purpose. She had been through hell, but she wasn't going to stay there. This house, this time away from everything, would be her sanctuary, her place to regroup and plan. And when she was ready, she would confront Frank on her own terms. "We should, because it was his first betrayal," Janice replied, her voice cold with resolve. "Once we divorce, I will strip him of everything. My rich inheritance, the house, the apartment where his mother now lives, and finally his precious car. I want him to walk away with nothing, not even a cent. And then I'll track down his mistress. And I'll make sure to watch as they struggle to make something of themselves." The detective, Pack, couldn't help but smile at her determination. "You're ruthless," he said, almost admiringly. "No," Janice corrected him, her eyes narrowing. "I'm just a woman who's been scorned. After I'm done with him, I'll meet with the best and most expensive lawyers to ensure he's out of my life for good." A voice in her head whispered doubts. "Money? Maybe he likes you. Don't be so cynical." But Janice brushed it off. "He thinks I'm the town idiot. Maybe for once in your life, you'll have a normal man who knows what it means to be a man." She rolled her eyes at the internal conflict, but kept silent. "How's work going?" she asked, changing the subject. "Oh, don't even ask," Pack replied with a chuckle. "Without you, the office has been in chaos. The boss has already gone through 3 assistants. Turns out you were doing a lot more than he realized." Janice had been living in the village for a month now. She had adapted to the small house and the quiet rural life. But the peace and restfulness, which had initially felt like a much-needed reprieve, were beginning to irritate her. All her life, Janice had been driven, always working, always moving forward. She had grown up in a modest family and started working immediately after finishing her studies. She never took time off without a reason and was always punctual. Now, for almost a month, she found herself doing almost nothing, and it was wearing on her. The first week had been productive. She spent it cleaning the house, bringing it up to a livable condition. But once the house was in order, she was left with silence and too much tranquility. She began waking up late, something she had never allowed herself to do before. She started reading the books Christina had brought, visiting elderly neighbors, and listening to their tales of days gone by. Yet, amid this forced relaxation, Janice couldn't shake the thought that she was constantly crossing paths with Elliot. The day Christina had arrived, Elliot had overheard their conversation about the broken window and had shown up to replace the glass. The next morning, Janice had thanked him with a homemade meat pie, and in return, he had fixed the old, creaky gate. This pattern continued. He would show up early, always seeming to find something that needed fixing, and Janice would offer him breakfast as a token of gratitude. It happened so frequently that she no longer felt surprised when she heard the familiar sound of him working outside or saw him standing under her window. Elliot had a habit of coming into the house, sitting down at the table, and just being there. Their conversations were never long or heavy. In fact, they often sat in comfortable silence. He didn't bring her flowers or shower her with compliments, but his presence was consistent, reliable. It was a strange, almost unnerving routine, and Janice found herself both puzzled and intrigued by his motives. What did he want? Why did he keep coming back? And why, despite everything, did she find herself looking forward to his quiet company? As she watched Elliot one morning, silently repairing a broken chair, Janice felt a deep curiosity bubbling within her. She wished with all her heart to understand this man who seemed content to just be there for her, without asking for anything in return. She couldn't help but wonder if there was something more behind his actions, something she hadn't yet grasped. Confess, Elliot, Janice teased as she watched him fix yet another broken item in her home. You just come here for the food, don't you? Elliot looked up from his work, a grin tugging at the corners of his mouth. I wouldn't say that he replied, his voice carrying a hint of amusement as he returned to what he was doing. Most of their conversations followed this pattern: short, light-hearted, and sprinkled with humor. It was easy, comfortable, and yet, beneath the surface, there was a growing curiosity in Janice about this man who seemed to have effortlessly become a part of her daily life. But not everyone in the village was so pleased with their burgeoning friendship. Rumors had begun to spread, and some of the local women, especially those with a keen interest in Elliot, were less than thrilled. One day, a brunette with strikingly lush curves stormed up to Janice's porch, her eyes flashing with anger. "Elliot is mine. Do you understand?" she declared, her voice dripping with menace. "You think you can just waltz in from the city and steal our men? How stupid are you?" Before Janice could respond, the woman angrily tore a leaf off a nearby tree and threw it at her, as if it were a weapon of warning. Janice stood there, dumbfounded, watching as the stranger stomped away, leaving her alone on the porch. When Elliot next appeared at her door, Janice couldn't resist telling him about the encounter with his passionate admirer. "Seems like you've got quite the fan club," she said, her tone half joking, half curious. Elliot grinned, but there was a hint of seriousness in his eyes as he asked, "Were you frightened?" Janice chuckled, shaking her head. "I'm not afraid of some country girl. I've dealt with far worse. When I worked in the city, I once refused to sign a contract for my boss, and 5 grown men in suits cornered me in the office. They practically tried to intimidate me right then and there. Now, that was scary. A leaf thrown by some overzealous groupie? Not so much, though I still don't understand why the man who seems to fix everything in my house has admirers like that." Elliot's smile deepened, but he didn't reply. Instead, he returned to his soup, as if her words had simply rolled off him, like water off a duck's back. Janice found his silence both frustrating and oddly comforting. As time passed, Janice noticed that Elliot hadn't visited her in a while. At first, she thought nothing of it. Perhaps he had grown tired of the routine. But as the days dragged on, she found herself missing his quiet presence more than she expected. Hoping to clear her mind, she decided to take a walk through the village. Though she wouldn't admit it to herself, part of her hoped she might run into him. Her walk took her past the village store, where she spotted Mrs. Tyler emerging with a look of concern etched on her face. The older woman was staring off into the distance, clearly troubled by something. "Mrs. Tyler, is something wrong?" Janice asked, approaching her. The woman sighed heavily, her worry evident. "Yes, there's trouble at Elliot's farm. Things are falling apart over there. Our men and women are all worried. They depend on that farm for work, and if it goes under, they'll have nowhere else to go. Elliot's always struggled to keep things running. But now it seems like everything's going wrong at once. Janice felt a pang of concern as she listened. Without hesitation, she decided to visit Elliot's farm to see for herself what was happening. It was a 2-kilometer walk from the village, and as she approached, the sight that greeted her was a far cry from the quiet efficiency she had come to associate with Elliot. The long, weathered building stood stark against the autumn sky, the lowing of cows echoing from within. In the backyard, a group of men worked grimly, their faces set with worry. Beyond the farm, the vegetable fields stretched out, barren now as fall settled in, their emptiness a stark contrast to the bustle of summer. Janice walked slowly toward the farm, her mind racing. She had known Elliot was quiet and reserved, but she had never guessed the extent of the burden he carried. The sight of the struggling farm, the worried workers, and the bleak fields painted a picture of a man who had been holding everything together by sheer will and was now close to losing it all. As she reached the farm, she spotted Elliot in the distance, talking to one of the men. His usual calm demeanor was still there, but she could see the tension in his posture, the strain in his eyes. Janice hesitated for a moment, then made her way over to him, determined to offer whatever help she could. Janice asked a passerby where Elliot's office was and made her way there. The office was small, almost claustrophobically so, with just enough space for a table and a chair in the center. In one corner stood a modest closet, and on the opposite wall, a small window let in a few feeble rays of sunlight. Elliot was hunched over the table, deep in concentration, silently mouthing words as he calculated figures and made notes on a stack of documents. Janice stepped closer and greeted him. Startled, Elliot turned abruptly, letting out a heavy sigh. "Is something broken again?" he asked, his voice laced with weariness. "I'm sorry, it's not a good time." "No," Janice replied, her tone gentle but firm. "I heard you were having some trouble, so I came to see if I could help. Is it something with the paperwork?" Elliot's expression hardened. "It's okay. I can handle it," he said, his tone curt. Undeterred, Janice moved closer, almost pushing him aside to get a look at the papers on the table. "Go away, or I'll have to drag you out of here by force," Elliot said loudly, his frustration evident. Janice looked up at him, her gaze steady. She then glanced down at the papers in his hands, quickly scanning the figures. It didn't take long for her to notice the glaring issues: huge sums of money being spent on unnecessary items, especially for a farm of this size. "Do you even have an accountant or a financial expert?" she asked, her voice calm but pointed. "I'm doing quite well on my own," Elliot repeated, though there was less conviction in his voice this time. Janice shook her head, a slight smile playing on her lips. "I can see how well you've been managing a fabulous spending spree to nowhere. You urgently need a specialist." Elliot's expression grew even more troubled. "And where am I supposed to find one?" he asked, his voice heavy with resignation. Janice grinned broadly and pointed to herself. "Right here. I have a degree in economics, and I worked for several years at a company where the costs and revenues were much higher than what you're dealing with here." Elliot stared at her for a moment, then sighed and waved his hand, as if surrendering. He sat down heavily in the chair, leaving Janice to sort through the papers. They worked together late into the afternoon, and by the time they finally left the office, darkness had settled over the farm. The workers had long since finished their tasks and gone home, leaving the place eerily quiet. As they walked toward the narrow path that led back to the village, Janice began to explain what she had found. "Why do you need both cauldrons and milk delivery 3 times a day? One is enough. It will be taken away, and the rest can be kept in the fridge. There's no point in driving cars back and forth, wasting money on fuel. And that's just one example, there are plenty more. The budgeting is a mess, to put it bluntly. Elliot scratched the back of his head, clearly overwhelmed. I was in the military, he admitted, his voice tinged with embarrassment. Accounting and budgeting are far from my expertise. My father always dreamed of having his own big farm, with fields stretching as far as the eye could see. I decided to fulfill that dream, even if it's a bit late. Janice looked at him with newfound understanding, her heart softening as they walked together down the narrow path. The wind had picked up and the cool air nipped at her cheeks, but she felt an unexpected calm and quiet settle over her. As they continued walking, Elliot suddenly broke the silence with a question that caught Janice off guard. So what's the story about the stroke? Janice flinched, the question pulling her back to the painful events that had led her here. She had almost forgotten that she had promised to tell him the truth. Letting out a loud exhalation, she decided to share her story. It's complicated, she began, her voice quiet as she gathered her thoughts. It started a few months ago. My husband Frank and I had been having problems for a while. I thought he still cared about me, but I needed to know for sure. So, I devised a plan. I faked a stroke, with the help of a doctor who owed me a favor. I wanted to see how Frank would react, whether he'd stand by me or if he'd turn his back. Elliot listened intently, not interrupting as Janice continued. I expected a lot of things, but I didn't expect him to leave me at that old house, practically abandoning me. He and his mother were so eager to be rid of me, hoping I'd just fade away quietly. It was devastating. I realized then that they didn't care about me at all. They were just waiting for me to die so they could move on with their lives. So I stayed at the house, waiting to see if he'd come back, but he never did. Elliot's expression remained serious, his gaze fixed on Janice. And what about now? What do you plan to do? Janice smiled faintly, though there was a hint of bitterness in her expression. Now, I'm going to make sure he pays for what he did. I'm not going to let him walk away unscathed. I've started working with a detective, and once I have all the evidence I need, I'll divorce him and take everything, his money, his property, everything. And then I'll rebuild my life on my own terms. Elliot nodded, impressed by her determination. You're stronger than you look, he said quietly. Janice laughed softly, the sound carrying on the wind. I've had to be. Life has thrown a lot at me, but I'm still standing. They walked in silence for a while longer, the connection between them deepening in the shared quiet. Despite everything, Janice felt a sense of relief wash over her. She had finally told someone the truth, and it felt like a weight had been lifted from her shoulders. As they reached the edge of the village, Janice turned to Elliot and smiled. Thank you, she said simply. For what he asked, genuinely curious. For being here, she replied, and for not asking too many questions. Elliot nodded, understanding that sometimes just being there for someone was enough. And as they parted ways, Janice knew that she had found a true friend in him, someone she could rely on as she navigated the challenges that lay ahead. That's when I came up with that plan, Janice continued, recalling her conversation with the detective. Christina helped me put it into action. She found a doctor who, for a fee, agreed to tell my husband that I was in intensive care after suffering a stroke and that I couldn't have visitors. After 2 weeks, the doctor informed Frank, in a very somber tone, that there was nothing more to be done, that I was nearing the end, and that I would be discharged to spend my final days at home, surrounded by family. Janice paused, her voice thick with emotion. During those 2 weeks, Frank called only twice, and when I finally came home in a wheelchair, I was met with indifference, as if I was already forgotten. He didn't want me around. He thought of taking me to this remote village so I could die quicker. But deep down, I was hoping that if he saw me at death's door, he might remember how much he once loved me. Maybe he'd leave his mistress, start taking care of me, and do everything he could to keep me alive. But I was cruelly mistaken. Elliot reached out and took Janice's hand, squeezing it tightly in a gesture of silent support. Janice looked down at their joined hands, feeling a warmth and comfort she hadn't expected. She nodded, grateful for the understanding and care she saw in his eyes. "Why don't you go back to the city?" Elliot asked after a moment. "At first I thought I'd just take it easy here, wait it out for a while," Janice replied. "But then I realized I didn't want to go back there yet. The city is so fast-paced, so full of memories of Frank and his mother. It's like the whole place is a reminder of everything I want to leave behind." Elliot released her hand and quickened his pace. "Come on," he said, a note of excitement in his voice. "I want to show you something." They walked for what felt like a long time, with Janice unsure of where they were headed. But when they finally arrived, she let out a gasp of surprise. In front of them stood a massive, elegant house, surrounded by a high fence. It was the kind of place that looked completely out of place in the quiet, rural surroundings. "This is the house of an old acquaintance of mine," Elliot explained. "We served together in the military. He passed away recently from cancer. Now, the house is up for sale and I've been dreaming of buying it back. But I don't have the money. The new buyers plan to tear it down and build a sawmill or something industrial. It breaks my heart to think of it being destroyed." Janice stared at the house, taking in its grandeur. It was beautiful, but also a symbol of something far more significant: a chance at a new life, a fresh start. "You realize that if you buy this house, there's no going back," Elliot said, his voice soft but serious. "I don't want to return to the city either. I'm too restless for the slow pace of the countryside. But I'm also too burnt out from the city's relentless speed. It's like I'm stuck between two worlds." Janice remained silent for a moment, her mind racing. The thought of buying the house, of making such a significant commitment, filled her with a strange mix of fear and excitement. It was a chance to escape her past, to build something new, something that was entirely her own. But it was also a leap into the unknown, a decision that would change everything. "I don't know if I'm ready for this," Janice finally admitted, her voice barely above a whisper. "But maybe this is exactly what I need." Elliot looked at her, his eyes filled with a quiet understanding. "You don't have to decide right now," he said gently. "But think about it. Sometimes, the biggest risks lead to the greatest rewards." Janice nodded, her mind still swirling with possibilities. The house stood before her, a symbol of a future she had never imagined for herself. And as she stood there, hand in hand with Elliot, she began to wonder if maybe, just maybe, this was the beginning of a new chapter, one that she could write on her own terms. As we close this chapter in Janice's story, we've journeyed with her through betrayal, heartbreak, and ultimately the discovery of her own strength. From faking her own illness to uncover her husband's true intentions, to finding unexpected solace and support in the most unlikely places, Janice has shown us the power of resilience and the importance of taking control of our lives, even in the face of overwhelming adversity. So, what have you learned from Janice's story? What insights or lessons will you take with you and apply in your own life? We'd love to hear from you. Please share in the comments below one thing you've learned from Janice's journey and how you plan to bring it into practice. If you liked this video, please leave your comment below, and don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to our YouTube channel. Thank you for watching, and stay tuned for more stories that inspire and empower.